Hey all, cadences. We're going to be talking about them and what they mean in music. And we're going to pull out the old guitar and apply these patterns to hear them in practice, but also look at the theory behind musical cadences. Because if you've been playing music for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes, you may have heard the phrase cadence. But they can sound a little bit obscure or complex because of the terminology used, because we have terms like authentic or perfect cadences, plagal cadences, imperfect or deceptive cadences. It's a lot of syllables, and like is often the case with musical terms and the jargon, the vocabulary of music, is that the words don't really do justice to the underlying patterns. The terms themselves sound way more complicated than what is really going on behind those words. So we're going to jump into cadences. And as always, if you're part of the replay crew, let us know where you're coming from. And let's talk cadences, because they can be a useful tool in your songwriting toolkit when it comes to coming up with chord progressions specifically. So cadences, just to kind of define the term cadence, it is like the rhythmic pattern or the rhythmic sequence or flow of sounds in language. So if you think of the cadence of something, it's a rhythmic flow. And the sounds in language, what words are to language, chords are to progressions. And so when we're talking about cadences in a musical sense, it's the flow between chords in a progression. But as the terms indicate, perfect or plagal, they refer to specific chord patterns or specific sequences between chords. And so let's look at them each in turn. And I'm going to, as we do here, pull up some diagrams that help make this visual, because when you can see what this is about, it makes a lot more sense. So let's look at the term cadence. Again, in summary, a cadence is a chord sequence that ends a musical phrase or section. What does that mean? Well, using the language metaphor here, if you think of, let's say that you have some poetry and you're going through this poetry, the lines of poetry, and you have the first line, and then after that first line, you have another line. So after the first line is like a comma, kind of temporarily or softly breaks the flow of that line, but the sentence isn't done until you get to the period. And then you have another line or another sentence, and let's say you have another comma that kind of softly breaks the flow of that sentence until you come to another period, and it's a hard stop. So a cadence is like the punctuation in a sentence, where you have kind of a temporary break in the flow or a pause in the flow, like a comma, like these commas here, or you have a harder stop, like these periods. And what do we mean by a harder stop, a soft stop, when it comes to music and musical sequences, chord progressions? Well, let's look at those, because it's actually there's a logic to how these work. Now, like I say, there are 4 types of cadences. You have a perfect cadence, a plagal cadence, and these are sometimes called finished cadences, or those harder stops. And then you have imperfect cadences and deceptive cadences, and those are more like the commas, or they're sometimes called unfinished cadences. So you have perfect and plagal, and those are like periods. They're the finished cadences, more like hard stops. And you have imperfect and deceptive cadences like commas, softer or temporary stops. Now, it's one thing to say a soft stop or a hard stop, and it's another thing to hear it in practice. So we're going to use some examples, and we're going to use the key of C as the source of the chords that we're going to use. Now, something to keep in mind when it comes to cadences, and really a lot of patterns, chord patterns, is that we could just pull up a guitar and say, and this will make sense here as we go along, but we could say in the key of C, that's a perfect cadence, and we could just like flow through these and just kind of like ram them into our minds. But let's kind of step back for a moment and make sense of the underlying patterns and why these chords work the way they do. And so first we're going to not just pull out the chords and play them and just kind of commit it to memory or learn through rote, which is not as beneficial as understanding what's going on. So all that to say, let's look at the underlying chords in the key of C, which is going to be our example here. And it is going to consist of 7 chords. Now, we talk about this in other live streams here, other posts, but in essence, you could take the 7 chords, and we're going to use this on the guitar, but we're going to just look at the C major scale here, for example, on the keyboard, which is saying, oh yeah, here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And these 7 notes are the basis of 7 chords, because we can just take every other note like C, E, and G, or D, F, and A, or E, G, and B, and so on, and build 7 chords, 7 triads, which are just 3-note chords from that. Now, when we do this, we get the 7 chords in the key of C. So we have C major, major 1, D minor, minor 2, so C major, D minor, minor 2. We have E minor, minor 3, F major, major 4, G major, major 5, A minor, minor 6, B diminished, a diminished 7, and back to C. So as we build each chord off the root note in the scale, we come up with 7 triads just by combining every other note. This every other note pattern is called tertian intervals, or intervals of major thirds and minor thirds. But what's really cool about this every other pattern is that if we look at the every other pattern of notes, we get this undulating sequence of intervals that cycles through all of those notes. And if we just focus on that every other pattern, so from C, so if we combine these 3 notes, for example, we have the C major chord, C, E, and G. If we combine these 3 notes together, the every other patterns, E, G, and B, is an E minor chord. So C major, and then E minor is the next one. If we combine the next 3 notes, G, B, and D, we have a G major chord right here, and so on. So we end up with this daisy chain pattern of chords, which is beautiful, actually. The fact that this cycle of thirds is connected in such an intricate, beautiful way. And I say cycle of thirds because we start on C, in the case of C, the key of C, and we end on C, and then it just repeats. Notice how we start out with this major third from C to E. Over here, we repeat it, C to E, but it's just this cycle of thirds that if we were to wrap it into a loop where we go in a counterclockwise direction, we end up with the circle of thirds. It's not a perfectly symmetrical circle because that pattern of major thirds and minor thirds kind of creates this slightly lopsided looking cycle, but it's a circle of thirds. Now, the circle of thirds is important because it is going to provide some insight into cadences. So by just at least starting out with these 7 chords and seeing how they're all connected in a given key, in this example, the key of C, we have C major, the major 1, which is made from notes C, E, and G. Then we have E minor, the minor 3, made from notes E, G, and B. G made from G, B, and D, the major 5. B diminished is B, D, and F. D minor is F, or D, F, and A. F major is F, A, and C. And then we have A minor, which is the minor 6, A, C, and E. You can see how, I know my lines are a little scribbly here, but you can see how it's this daisy chain pattern. All of these chords overlap into this sequence of chords. So if we were to play those in sequence, going in a counterclockwise direction, starting at the bottom with C. So we're going in this counterclockwise direction. We have C, and then E minor, G major, and then B diminished, D minor, F major, A minor, and C. So in sequence, that's in order from C, and then I just went around the loop back to C again. Now, why all this emphasis on the circle of thirds? I thought we were going to talk about cadences. Well, cadences make sense, especially when you kind of have your bearings in a given key. In this example, the key of C, where we know how the chords are related, how they're connected, and how you can kind of flow between these chords. Now, I have the Roman numerals here representing each chord. Now, just to focus on the C chord, for example, C, E, and G, even though the chord is made from these three notes, those are the three notes that you combine to make the chord. If we just treat this root note, C, as the chord, as the Roman numeral shows, we can kind of think of just that C as the C chord. Now, it includes all of the notes in that chord, but we could say, for example, if we wanted to flow between a C major chord, a G major chord, and then come back to C again, we could just show it like that, from C to G to C. So that's just a chord progression from C to G, where we're just kind of moving back and forth between the root notes. Or as another example, we could say, hey, let's play, let's go from C to A minor to D minor over to G and C again, and we have a chord progression of 1, minor 6, minor 2, 5. So that's a cool chord progression. C, A minor, D minor, G major, and C. So the circle of thirds provides this harmonic space that we can explore and move around between the chords to come up with this chord progression. We're getting closer to cadences here, because cadences are really just different types of chord progressions. But now that we kind of have our bearings, we can move through harmonic space within the circle of thirds. We can start to look at cadences. Just as an aside, in this circle of thirds, we're just looking at the key of C, but these same patterns are applied to all 12 keys, because all 12 keys are symmetrical, meaning that the same patterns and principles apply to every key. If you want to play, it's 360 different chord progressions in all of the different keys that I have in the music theory course. I think it's a bonus exercise to lesson 7. It's either lesson 7 or lesson 8 in the course, where there's tons of patterns where you can get a feel for the circle of thirds, a really big feel. You can get a feel for all these different chord progressions. So anyway, given that, let's look at this pattern on the guitar. Now, so far we've just been kind of dealing with theoretical patterns, or the patterns based on the colors and shapes that illuminate the underlying relationships between these notes. And we have, in this example, let's say this C chord is just a C shape, and I'm translating that in my head into a C major chord, an open C major chord in this example on the guitar. If we were to apply these patterns, like in this case, the C major scale, so we have, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, in various octaves up the fretboard. If we combine those notes, every other note, like we did in the table a little earlier on, in a table format, now if we apply these on the guitar fretboard, you can see directly how you can combine those notes in intervals of thirds, tertian intervals, to create the 7 chords that I've been playing, but now you can actually see it on the guitar. So we have, going from left to right. So we have C major, a D minor chord, an E minor chord, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and back to C. So now that we have our bearings with the chords, and you can kind of get a feel for how to play the chords on the guitar, and I have all of these in a post on Locals that has these diagrams that you can go through at your own pace to kind of soak it in. But let's go back to the circle of thirds knowing that those chords we just looked at, the actual fingering is how you play these chords, but we're just going to use the theoretical visual of the circle of thirds to move through harmonic space here. And we have, in another video, I talk about harmonic function, but basically you can say that these three chords in the circle of thirds serve the role, in air quotes, of stability. Those are stable chords in a key, especially a major key where the tonic or the tonal home bass is 1. Then we have chords of change up here, the subdominant chords. We have chords of tension, dominant chords. And so we have chords of change, chords of tension, and chords of stability. And again, we're getting to cadences and how cadences are different chord progressions that move through this harmonic space in certain ways to create, like we say, using the punctuation metaphor in language, a sense of kind of temporary pause or a slight break in the flow of a chord progression, and some that have a harder break in the flow, like the periods in a sentence. So looking at the circle of thirds in this way, we're going to start with a perfect cadence. And a perfect cadence is, well, you might call it perfect, hence the name, perfect cadence. And it is basically a progression of 5 to 1, or a chord of tension to this main chord of stability. So from this 5 to 1 is a perfect cadence. And if you have a chord of tension and it's coming to this chord of stability, this is very much like, this is like the classic period in a sentence where you have, so imagine you're playing, a C chord, it's the tonic, it's the tonal home bass, it's a chord of stability, and then we have this chord of change, this 5 chord. That 5 chord really wants to resolve to that 1. The 5 chord is called the dominant chord because it has a dominant presence in a key, but also because it hangs over or really wants to resolve to that 1. And so if you hear that 5 to the 1, it's almost like a period in a sentence where you're like, oh, I've arrived home. I could finish my story here and I'm totally good. The story's done. It is a big old period in our musical sentence, as it were. So that is a perfect cadence. And it's classic. It's very common. It's a great way to bring resolution to a chord progression, whether the chord progression is the very end of the song, or it could be a chord progression that ends the section of a song, like the verse section, and then it could bring you into the chorus and move the song, progress the song along as you go. But it's a really good one, perfect cadence. So like I say, looking at the guitar, we have a G in the key of C as our example, a G to a C, that 5 to that 1. They call it perfect because it's basically the perfect setup for a nice sense of resolution. Moving along to the next one, just kind of, and we do have in the circle of fifths, just to kind of see it in different ways. In the circle of fifths, that counterclockwise motion from the 5 to the 1 is what that looks like in the circle of fifths. So in the key of C, for example, 5 to 1, or a G to a C in our example. In any key though, so we could move this around and say, let's say that we're in the key of D. It's still the same relative positioning. So we have A to a D. So a perfect cadence in the key of D would be from an A to a D because it's a 5 to a 1. Or likewise, any other key. We could choose any key, and that's the beauty of music, is that because every key is symmetrical, is consistent from one to the next, these patterns apply to every key. But we're going to go back to the key of C because that's what all of my other illustrations are in. So we'll stick with the key of C, where we have G to C. But let's look at the next kind of cadence because it's more than perfect. We have some less than perfect cadences. And what does that mean? So in this example, we have a plagal cadence. Now, a plagal cadence is a term that's like a holdover from back in the day, from like the classical analysis of music. And a lot of times the classical analysis of music is about a major key. And so these terms are referring to a major key where, again, our tonic is a major one. It's in a major key. But a plagal cadence sounds nice, and it's almost as perfect, in air quotes, as the perfect cadence, but it's from a 4 to the 1. So from, in this example, F to C. So we have, it's still considered a finished cadence or like a period in a sentence because let's say you're in the key of C. Let's establish C as the tonic. And then we go from F and that brings us back home. It's a sense of resolution, and you could consider that to be done, whether it's the end of the song or, like I say, the end of a section, or just a progression where it brings a sense of resolution like a big old period. Using the chord diagrams, that would be an F. I'll play it as the bar version shown here. So a 4, which sounds nice. It's not quite as resolute as the perfect cadence of 5 to 1. That really sounds nice, hence the name perfect. But plagal is also quite satisfying. And the reason that plagal and perfect have such a strong resolution to the tonic is especially clear if we use the circle of fifths, where notice how, okay, so in the circle of fifths, we have a plagal cadence which arrives at the tonic coming from the other direction. So in this example, it's clockwise from 4 to 5. So whereas the perfect cadence of 5 to 1 is the neighbor, so the tonic in our example is 1. From 5 to 1 is a perfect cadence, or from 4 to 1 is a plagal cadence. Notice how both of those chords flank the tonic, or C in this example, in the circle of fifths. And you can see that they're harmonically related. Red-orange is closely related to red. Purple-red is closely related to red. And it's more than just a visual analogy. In other videos, I talk about how the circle of fifths is formed by a daisy chain pattern. There's that term again, daisy chain pattern of major scales that all overlap or bleed seamlessly into each other, which forms the circle of fifths. And those, just in the same way that keys share the same notes, they also share the same chords and share certain harmonic relationships together. And these neighboring notes, or these neighboring chords in this case, are very harmonically related. So that's why the 4 to the 5 sounds especially satisfying, or the 5, I said the 4 to the 5 I meant the 4 to the 1, or a plagal cadence, is satisfying, just like the 5 to a 1 is also satisfying. And so those are the two main types of finished cadences, or the periods in our language metaphor of perfect and plagal. But there are a couple more cadences that we'll look at here that also sound pretty satisfying, actually. So let's get at the next one, which is an imperfect cadence. And an imperfect cadence is interesting because, again, it's an imperfect cadence is a type of unfinished cadence, which is more like a comma. Okay, so it's not going to sound as resolute as a perfect or plagal cadence or a finished cadence because it's more like a comma. It doesn't bring you to such a strong sense of resolution. In other words, it doesn't bring you to the tonic, because the tonic, being the home base of the song, is the ultimate period. And so an imperfect cadence is a chord progression or a chord sequence that doesn't move to the tonic. In other words, is a fancy or long way of saying it. An imperfect cadence is going to land on the 5. And we can get there from a couple of different directions. From a 2 to a 5, from a 4 to a 5, or also we could have a 1 to a 5. So an imperfect cadence is in the key of C. Let's just establish the tonic again as C. So we're gonna go in order from this D minor to 5, this F major to 5, or the G, or this C to the G, and we've got 3 different imperfect cadences. So a D minor, and that 5, that G in this case, because it wants to resolve to the C, the tonic, it's imperfect because you're like, oh, it's kind of like a comma. You're like, it begs the question, what more is there to come? We're not done. We're on a 5, and that sense of tension is unfinished, hence the term an unfinished kind of cadence. So 2 to 5 is an example, and I just drew commas here. Those are supposed to be commas to represent the different types. Now let's play the 4 to 5, or an F to G in this example. And that 5 is like, oh, what more is there to come? So it's like a comma again. Or from a 1 to a 5, that we're going from a chord of stability, in this case, a 1 to a 5, and you're like, oh, okay. So, and then you could come back to the 1. So these chord diagrams illustrate each of those in chord format, where let's play them each in turn. So we're going to start with this comma, and then this comma, and then this comma. And at the end, I put the period to go in each example. Each of these is the imperfect cadence, from the 2 to the 5 to the 4 to the 5 and the 1 to the 5. And then this brings us the perfect cadence in each of these examples to finally bring us to a stronger sense of resolution. But let's start with the ones in boxes here, the imperfect cadences. So we have a 2. Like you want, it's like you want to hear it come to the 1. That's an example. Then F, to finish off that perfect cadence at the very end, or C. Want to come back to that period in the end. Just like in language, like if you trail off in a sentence, you could say ... is kind of like a comma, in that it's not really a resolution to your sentence. You're just kind of trailing off or leaving it hanging. And as a storyteller, or as a musical storyteller, as a songwriter, you don't want to really leave your audience hanging. You want to give them a sense of resolution, typically, unless you're going for the cliffhanger. And sometimes you will actually hear songs that end with an imperfect cadence, because it is kind of like a cliffhanger, which is pretty clever, because then the listener, if it was a good song, they're like, I have to hear that song again, because at least earlier in the song, I'm going to hear that tonic, and it's going to bring me a sense of resolution. And then they come to the end, and they're like, oh, it's another cliffhanger. Let me hear the song again. And the song gets a lot of plays. So let's go to, and in the circle of fifths, these chords all come to the 5 as a temporary pause in the progression. It could come from the 2, or it could come from the 4, or it could come from the 1, all arriving at 5 as a kind of comma in the sentence. That's an imperfect cadence, and it can be very effective. There's also a deceptive or interrupted cadence. This one's pretty cool, actually. So you have, in this example, we're going from, I'm going to draw the groupings to, again, show that these are chords of tension, these are chords of change, and these are chords of stability, using the traditional roles of harmonic function, where we have, I'm just going to put an S for stability, a C for change, and a T for tension. In a perfect cadence, we would have here, I'm going to draw it with this one. We would have this nice 5 to 1 progression, where it's like, it's like, oh, so satisfying. But A deceptive cadence is, as the name indicates, deceptive. It's like the pump fake of chord progressions, where imagine, back in the day, Michael Jordan, was a master. He'd be dribbling the ball down the basketball court and he would look like he was going to pass the ball to a teammate, but then like throw it behind his back, or, vice versa. He would zig when people thought he was going to zag. That is what a deceptive cadence is, where you think if you're on a 5, it's like, oh, it's such a common, satisfying progression, we're going to go to the 1. But a deceptive cadence plays with that sense of anticipation, plays with that sense of, oh, I think I know where this is going, and does a pump fake. Instead of going to this chord of stability, or the tonic, it overshoots the mark and passes the ball, and using our basketball metaphor, to this 6 chord, this minor 6. So in this example, instead of going from G to C, we go from G to A minor. So it's like, ooh, it does kind of sound like a comma. We're not fully resolved because we landed on a chord of stability, but it's all relative. It's not fully stable. It's kind of stable. And when I say it's all relative, I mean that with the pun intended, because it is C's relative chord, or the 1's relative minor. So in this case, notice how C, E, and G are the notes in the C major chord, but the notes in the C minor chord are A, C, and E. So C and E are shared by the 1 and the 6, the minor 6. So it's the relative minor. A minor, or the minor 6, is a relative to C major, or the major 1 in this case. So A minor and C are 2 chords that sound pretty similar, actually, because they share 2 of the same notes. And so by going from the 5 to the 6, overshooting the 1 and going to the 6, it's like kind of like going to the 1 because it shares 2 of the same notes, but it doesn't sound as resolved. So you're going 5 to 6. You're like, oh, wait, so what then? How's this going to go? And then you could land on the 1. You could go immediately to the 1, or you could, move through harmonic space and eventually get there. So in this case, a deceptive or interrupted cadence. It's deceptive because it's a pump fake, or it's interrupted because it's not, it's a roundabout way. It's not going directly to that perfect cadence. So this is the deceptive cadence. And then in this example, I just go to the 1 to bring us a sense of resolution. So we start with a comma and we end with a period in this example. So 5. And then we ultimately land on resolution. Again, a song doesn't have to end on the tonic. It doesn't have to end with a full stop, a finished period. You can get creative and apply your own artistry to the process of progressions, but that is how we define these cadences. So in this example, in the circle of fifths, we're going from this 6 to the 5. The configuration of chords in the circle of thirds versus the circle of fifths is a little bit different based on how each of these patterns are structured. The circle of thirds, as we looked at earlier, is a cycle of tertian intervals that naturally forms based on a daisy chain pattern of major and minor thirds. A circle of fifths is a natural formation that naturally forms from a daisy chain pattern of major scales. They're both formed by daisy chain patterns, but in different ways. And each has its own benefits, as I talk about in detail in lesson 19 of the course, which I'll be publishing coming up in the music theory course. So in this example, again, we're at A minor to G, ultimately making our way back to the 1. So A minor in the deceptive cadence. So, we're going from 5 to the A minor. Pardon me. I wrote it the other way. So when I drew this, what I meant to draw was from 5 to A minor instead, going that direction. So in this example, it's 5 to minor 6, and then we can make our way to the 1 again. Now, these 4 cadences, like I say, have kind of odd sounding, mysterious, and maybe sophisticated names. They're just old-fashioned names, basically. Perfect, plagal, imperfect, and deceptive. But once you understand the logic behind these patterns, it's pretty cool. And actually, the names are apropos. Perfect, from a 5 to a 1. Sounds pretty perfect. Plagal, it's not as intuitive. It's an older term that just refers to a 4 to a 1. Imperfect is from a minor 2 to a 5, or from a 4 to a 5, or from a 1 to a 5. And then a deceptive cadence is from a 5 to a 6, or a minor 6, which is a pump fake on our way ultimately to the tonic, in this case C major in the key of C. Cadences are actually pretty cool, and you can use these just like you would with writing, with composition in a written language, using commas and periods. You know, a lot of times people downplay the value of commas and periods in written language and just kind of have a block of text, but that can be pretty hard to read. I know with texting or just, you know, posting on social media, you know, commas and periods go by the wayside sometimes, but they actually do serve a valuable purpose, especially if you want your reader to understand what you're saying and have your message come across with some impact, in the same way that you could use and can use cadences like the punctuation in the language of music to convey your ideas and really have impact with your songs. So those are cadences in a nutshell, with some examples on the guitar. Like I say, these diagrams are will be added to the post, the heads up post for this live stream on Locals, so that you can play through these examples and really soak it in at your own pace. But let's geek out here and chat on some of the comments here. Hey, Rossalite, it's cool to have you on. So Chordify has Keith Whitley's song "Don't Close Your Eyes" in the key of C major, but he has, I think, what is a perfect cadence in the song. Looking forward to tonight's episode. Well, I'm glad you're here. And so Keith Whitley, if that is in this example, a 5 to a 1 being a perfect cadence, definitely would make sense. It's a really popular chord progression in any key. Like I say, we looked at the key of D as an example of A major to D major, or any other key. 5 to 1 is perfect, and it is so satisfying that you'll hear it a lot. It's a good one. Drum Lover, hello. I'm still getting into chords and progressions. Thanks. Well, thanks for being here. And yeah, chords and progressions are, it's like an endless, the sidewalk never ends. The chord progressions are so beautiful. There's so much at play because the underlying relationships between the notes, all of those relationships, like I talk about in part 1 of the course, the fundamentals, notes and intervals have this geometric relationship, and those geometric relationships apply not only at the micro level of notes and intervals, but at the macro level of chords and progressions. So once you understand them, these relationships at the atomic level, chords and progressions make a lot of sense, because it's just you're building on those same patterns and principles. So I'm glad you're here, and I love the fact that this is helpful. Owl, hey, it's cool to have you on. So can you explain a cadence called a half cadence or an open cadence? So a half cadence is like, it's any cadence ending on the dominant chord, though the dominant is normally played after the 1, the 2, or the 4 chord. So you could also end on a diminished 7. So in this example, let's go to, I'm going to pull up a diagram here. Well, let me find one that doesn't have a bunch of scribbles on it. Hold on just one sec, and then I'll share my screen. Do I have one that doesn't have a bunch of scribbles? Okay, so let's go to here. Perfect. So in this case, it's kind of, you could half, I've described it with the terminology of like an imperfect cadence, but where you're going from a 2 to a 5, a 4 to a 5, or a 1 to a 5 often. Now, I call these chords of tension. Sometimes the chords of tension are called dominant chords. The namesake coming from that 5, because it's kind of the anchor, or the most common chord in the chords of tension in terms of chord function. These are collectively called dominant chords. So you could go to the 7 chord, the diminished 7 chord, or you could also just go to the 5. Now, in the same way that we talked about the minor 6 sharing 2 of the same notes with the 1 chord, G major, G, B, and D shares 2 of the same notes with B diminished, B, D, and F. So going to a G chord and a G7 chord or a B diminished chord are very similar. They're harmonically very closely related. So when we talk about a half cadence also sometimes going to a diminished 7 chord, it's because it's just going to a chord of tension. Chords of tension, another name for that is dominant chords. And so hopefully that makes some sense and it addresses your question there. It's a good question. Owl. Does every phrase in music end with a cadence? Not every phrase in music necessarily ends with the cadences that we've outlined here. These are helpful terms and concepts, and especially in like a major key, in a major key that we're talking about here. But when you start getting into modal harmony and other, songs that are in maybe like Dorian mode, or some other types of progressions, it won't necessarily follow these exact rules. These that we're speaking to here are largely in the context of Ionian, and Ionian is another name for a major key. And even then, the progression won't necessarily follow these rules, just like you won't necessarily have a certain comma. You could have a semicolon, or you could have an exclamation point instead of a period. I know that the punctuation metaphor isn't exact, but along those lines, you can have progressions that can deviate from these rules. These are just general guidelines that can help with stemming or channeling the flow of a progression as it moves through time. That's a good question. Dave, hey, it's cool to have you on. So another Monday night of learning and geeking out. Yes, I love geeking out with you, and music theory is nothing if it's not geeking out. Yeah, it's fun to definitely, learn all of these patterns and then apply them and have music fill the air with the sounds that these diagrams outline. It's a lot of fun. And with that, it's kind of a summary of cadences. Like I say, I'll be posting these diagrams on Locals, so you can check them out and soak them in at your own pace. And I am working on the next produced video. I'm so excited to be getting into some of the videos that have animations and allow for geeking out, to speak of geeking out, in such a way that some of these diagrams come to life. And so be on the lookout for that as it's going to be rolling out here. Rodney, see your question here. Oh, I keep clicking it, and so does Virtuous Heretic, so I'll click it again. So does E minor have any function here? So E minor is a chord of stability in the circle of thirds. Now, this diagram is super marked up, so it's a little bit scribbly, but this E minor chord is a chord of stability. In what we're talking about here in terms of perfect and plagal cadences and all of that, it doesn't show up as an example in these, but the E minor chord and to the question about Owl's question about does every phrase in music end with a cadence? Phrases can end on a minor 3, or can end on chords that weren't necessarily spelled out here. So like I say, these are guidelines that help with the structure of a progression without necessarily following them. They can be helpful, but they could potentially be a hindrance if you try to think of it. If you think about commas and periods in your writing, then your story might take a backseat to, the punctuation, in the same way that a chord progression, these are helpful rules and helpful guidelines, but not necessarily rules that make or break a story. As long as the story is good, you can play with these patterns. So thank you for geeking out with me tonight. And like I say, be on the lookout for this produced video, which I'm very excited to be rolling out. coming right up. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening, day, morning, night, wherever you might be, and we will be talking very soon. I'll see you. Bye.